Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Sean, we have a quorum.
Well, I think that we don't have any action items today.
Okay.
And I suspect that there will be people sprinkling in here over the next several minutes. I know that Carroll County's presentation is fairly detailed and that they may need a little more time than the previous presentations on holding capacity in previous meetings. So yeah, I think if we get started, I think that would make sense. And as people arrive, they arrive.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order for the Cooperative Forecasting Group. And the first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. The minutes were sent out to everybody, and hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at them. And if there's no recommended or suggested changes, we'll accept a motion to approve.
I'll approve.
Okay, and a second.
Oh, here comes a few others. I think you can go ahead, Steve, for that.
Okay.
Right.
So with the minutes, we have a motion to approve. Do we have a second from anybody?
Yeah, I guess I will. How's that?
Okay, so all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, let the record show the minutes passed unanimously. And we'll move forward to the second agenda item, methods for calculating holding capacity, land use potential. And we have Kathleen Comer presenting on Carroll County's holding capacity analysis. So we'll turn it over to Carroll County.
Okay, and I'm gonna stop my video and open up the presentation. So let me see if it's, oh, let me just share. It says you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Okay. Here, let me do that for you. Oops. Oh, there you go, Kathleen. Try it again, please.
Let's see if it will work. Oh no, here we go. Let's see if it works.
Terrific. We can see the screen, Kathleen.
All right, this looks, but I'm like looking at my, is it switching screens? Is it moving through the presentation as I do this?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so I'll just, because some of this, now I'm trying to get rid of some of the other, hang on a minute. I got some things interfering with my view. If I can get that down. So, push that down a little bit. All right, so let me begin. Carroll County, well, first of all, I have Sandy Baber from the Department of Land and Resource Management with Carroll County has joined the meeting. And Land and Resource Management, Sandy Baber and Mike Roberts are the ones who actually work on the BLI calculations for Carroll County. And the methodology is a collaborative effort between the Land and Resource Management and the Department of Planning. And I put this presentation together with consultation and advice from Mike Roberts and Sandy Baber. So it's a collaborative effort here. And Sandy in particular works on the commercial BLI. Mike was not able to be here. He's the individual that does the residential. So if there's any questions, we'll do our best to answer for the residential BRI. And as you can see, the holding capacity methodology, we call it the buildable land inventory method. And we also have a couple methods for calculating BLI. We base it on, one method is to base it on zoning, and there are 3 levels of estimate: high, medium, and low. And we also process it and calculate it for designated land use or future land use. For this presentation, we're just going to focus on zoning. And the first step is really to identify the layers that you use for calculating the BLI, and that will include absolute constraint layers, partial constraint layers, and other data layers that include the parcel layer, zoning, and this also includes municipal zoning, land use, address points, things like that. And I'm going to go ahead and first talk about the residential BLI. And when we talk about lot yields going forward, that's housing units. And this is just the steps. I'm going to go through them, so I'm just going to skip over this. A lot of the information in these slides, I'm not going to go over all the details, but the details are there if you guys want to look at it later. So, I'm going to try to go fairly quickly through the slides. Okay, so the first step is to update and assemble the data layers that you're using. So, to update the absolute constraints, the partial constraints, and you want to create a feature class called residential BLI, and it's based on the parcel layer polygons and some select fields that are extracted from the parcel data. And here's some of the absolute constraints. I have a slide on that, so I'm just going to go quickly through this. So there are absolute constraints where the entire parcel is removed if it encompasses the entire parcel. There are other absolute constraints where maybe only a portion of the parcel is removed. And so here's some samples of absolute constraints. You can see that we includes towers, railroads, floodplains, water bodies, transportation right-of-ways. We also ag easements and ag remainders are also considered absolute constraints. And then there are partial constraint layers, and they're only used to knock down the estimates. They're only used for low estimates. And generally it impacts only a portion of the parcel. And here's a sample of some partial constraints. And again, these might just impact a portion of a parcel. And so only a portion of the parcel might be removed from the BLI. It includes stream buffers, wetlands, steep slopes. Yeah. And some other data layers, like I said, the parcel layer, which is the base for the BLI, address point zoning. I'll just move through that. And this is just a sample because this sample is on zoning. So here's a sample of zoning in the Eldersburg area. So the next step, step 2, is to remove or erase absolute constraints from the parcel layer, and transportation right-of-ways can be just deleted directly. And again, as I stated before, some absolute constraints require removing the entire parcel, and then others just impacting portions of environmental easements, etc. And here's a sample of constraints, both absolute and partial constraints near the Carroll County Airport. And the purple area is county-owned land. So That would be an absolute constraint. Here's what it looks like. Here's how it impacts the BLI. So then if you were to, the BLI is in the blue, and it shows residential units. The numbers in there are the allowed residential units. And so you can see how the partial constraints influence. You can still see that there are BLIs that have partial constraints on them. And then there's the absolute constraints where you'll see, like around the airport, there's no BLI there. And this is what's left. So you kind of go like this. So that's how the constraints influence the BLI calculations. And then you union, or however you want to do it, union or join the parcel data layer with the county zoning layers, and that includes the municipal zoning. So what you see over here on zoning, some of it, as you can see, is municipal, some of it's county. So that gets joined to the parcel layer. And on step 4, you want to identify and keep in the working layer all parcel whose zoning allow residential development. So right away, you want to delete all parcels having an industrial zoning designation. But you want to keep parcels in the working layer that are residential and R 7500, R 10,000, 20,000, 40,000. Those are all residential. But we also allow some residential in some commercial and employment campus. So that would stay in the database. And then you want to add the BLI fields. I'm not going to go through all these. Some of these are just for calculations and they get deleted from the final database. So a lot of these are working fields. And then you want to populate these new fields in the attribute table. And again, you can read what these are. For instance, the new acres field, you're just basically using the geometry tool to calculate the area of all the parcels. And there's a multiplier field to knock down estimates for medium and low estimates. And then there's a minimum lot field, a minimum lot size for each zoning district. But again, the multiplier here in the middle column is only used for medium and low estimates. All right, which I think I slipped over here. And these are just some more fields. And one of the fields is the improved field. And that's how we identify parcels that already have development on it. That would be an improved field, and parcels that are vacant. And vacant parcels are equal to 0. Improved parcels have a 1 value. And the improved field affects high, medium, and low estimates. And we use address points to identify vacant versus improved. So you can see the blue, where all the address points are, those are improved parcels. And then the lighter, it looks kind of cream colored there. That's the vacant land. And that's how it impacts the BLI. So typically the vacant parcel will allow a little bit more development. Basically, on the final value, the 1 is subtracted off. So for all improved parcels, 1 would be subtracted. So here you see the improved parcels are in blue and the vacant in the greenish. That's how it impacts the BLI. And then there's some additional fields, and you can read over those. There's descriptions on what they are, but they're basically used in the calculation process. So step 7 is to calculate what we call int lots H. That's the high estimates. Int lots M is the medium, and then int lots L is the low estimates. And we do this first for parcels zoned agriculture. And for these ag zone parcels, high, medium, low estimates are actually all equal. So, and for the ag zone, their potential lot estimates are based on the gross acreage of the parcel. And so this is how many lots would be allowed for so many acres for the ag zone parcels. And these are for ag only. So you can see that the more acreage there is, the number of lots there's a higher number of lots allowed on them. And then you calculate the high estimate for parcels zoned residentially zoned parcels and conservation. And they're calculated based on the minimum lot sizes for each parcel, and also based on, we do consider sewer service. That's based on both sewer service and zoning category. And again, it mentions for the improved parcels, you subtract 1 from the result. And we always round down to an integer value. And with sewer, any parcel outside of sewer cannot exceed 7 units when outside of the planned service area. And this is the table. It's actually showing high, medium, and low estimates, but it shows the yield with sewer and the yield without sewer, and also according to the zoning district. It's allowed units by lot size and zoning and sewer. And the residential yield, I'm just gonna, this is like a kind of like a zoom in of the lot size. If outside of sewer service area or improved and vacant, these are the allowed units. And then the next step is to calculate the medium estimates for the residential and conservation districts. And the medium estimates getting the estimates are knocked down using multipliers. So, and also the improved parcels subtract 1 from the result and round down to an integer value. And so here's the multipliers by zoning for both the medium and the low estimates. So both medium and low use the multiplier, in addition to the minimum lot size requirements by zoning district. It's a sample of the zoning again. So here's the zoning, and this is how that impacts the BLI. So this is what remains as potentially buildable. And the area that you see that's employment campus, you can see that residential development could potentially is potentially allowed in some commercial districts and employment. You'll see another one down here in the red that's a commercial district that allows 69. So oops, make sure, there we go. Then the next step is to calculate the low estimates for parcels zoned residential and conservation. And these estimates require the removal of the partial constraints from the working BLI residential feature class. And so you could use the erase function to remove partial constraints. And after you do that, you have to recalculate the acreage for each parcel because they've changed. And again, so once you do that, remove the partial constraints, you recalculate the acreage, then those low estimates are calculated based on the multipliers and the minimum lot size. And again, improved parcels subtract 1 from the result. And then the next step is to calculate the high, medium, and low estimates for parcels that are zoned commercial and employment campus. So if they meet certain criteria, based on the table, here's what's allowed for residential development. And again, it's also based on sewer, areas in sewer and outside of sewer. And the next step is to clean the final residential BLI database. So a lot of the working fields that were used in the calculation are removed, but we still keep in, the acreage, the multipliers that were used, the zoning, whether it was improved, whether it had sewer. And in this case, you'll see the field with the units is the field that's lots M adjusted. And that's our medium level estimates. And a lot of our maps are based on the medium level estimates. And so now I'm going to go over the commercial development, and it's also using the zoning method. And when I use the word commercial, that includes industrial and employment campus. So going forward, when I say commercial, that's what I'm referring to. And again, we have a multi-step process. I'm going to jump into the steps. Again, just like with the residential BLI, the first step is to assemble and update the data layers used for calculating commercial BLI. And then you want to create a feature class called commercial BLI. And you spatially join the parcel data layer. So it's also based on the parcel data layer polygons. And you join them with the county zoning layers, including the municipalities. So once you add, and so you'll see here a field called zoning. And you also add a BLI field for location and acres to the database. And the next step is to identify the improved versus unimproved parcels using the county address points layer, just like the same process that was used in the residential BLI. And you add a field called vacant, and for parcels that are improved, the vacant field would have a no in it. And then for fields that are vacant, you would have a yes in it. And the next step is to identify absolute constraints and remove impacted parcels or portions of impacted parcels. And so basically, again, the transportation roads right-of-ways can be deleted. And you either erase or cut out parcels or portions of parcels that are impacted by absolute constraints, which include impervious surfaces, FEMA floodplains, and wetlands. So that's how that looks. So you can see that the impervious surfaces, kind of cut out of the parcel. So what's left of the parcel in red for the commercial BLI, then you calculate the acreage. So that's how the constraints impact the commercial BLI. And again, calculating the commercial BLI acreages. That's just a sample there. And then the next step is to identify developed parcels that are not further developable based on a manual parcel by parcel analysis. And you would either cut out or delete from the database. And also in this process, you also look for parcels that are like slivers or so small that you couldn't have development. So basically anything less than 0.05 acres would just be deleted. And then the parcel by parcel analysis would also include looking at use and occupancy data, approved county and municipal commercial subdivisions data, stormwater management, recorded plots, facilities, pipes, things like that. And this is a sample of some layers that are used for the parcel by parcel analysis. So here we show commercial projects in process, approved municipal commercial site plans. We also have the non-residential UNOs. So those are some of the layers that are used in that analysis. And then you clean the final commercial BLI database, make it look nice, clean up any data fields to ensure you clean up and review any data fields to ensure accuracy and consistency. And then here's 2022's final residential and commercial BLI totals as per zoning. And these are the medium estimates scenario for the residential. And then we also have the commercial on the right side. Commercial is in acreage, and the residential is in lots, the potential lots. And we do this by the growth area. So you can see the values for each of the growth areas. You can also see the value for outside the growth area. Oops, hang on. And these are again medium level estimates. And then the final map showing both residential and commercial BLI, residential in blue, commercial BLI in red. All right, so if there's any questions. Oops, there we go. Hang on, I just said. So are there any questions or are there any slides you wanted to look at more closely?
As far as that was a very detailed presentation, and I can tell you that the going parcel by parcel, property by property, looking at development potential of each property is something I can relate to very well. As far as trying to predict the build out of the county. That's a lot of work that goes into looking at all those individual properties to come up with what that individual potential is. And then you did mention that in the rural areas, you have no more than 7. So does that tie to the tier mapping and the septic bill?
I'm not sure about that. Sandy, would you happen to have any insight on that?
Yes, that's correct. That's tied to that state legislation.
Yeah. And then from year to year, how often do you update this based on like the number of building permits and demolition permits that come through? What's a frequency that you refine this?
So we go ahead and we update it yearly as part of our annual report to the state.
Okay.
We might not completely run it every year. We might just do an update with building permits and things like that. So, you know, recently Carroll's been going through their comprehensive rezoning, so it's caused us to relook at how often we update it, just because of some things aren't tied necessarily with the calendar year. But
Sure.
we definitely rerun the bottom line numbers every year.
Okay,
And I'll add to it, we, for the most part, do this manually. When we started in 2004, early 2000s with our process, we had someone on staff that built a model, did a model builder to do the residential portion. But we've done enough tweaking over the years that we pretty much do it manually. But we are right now in the process of updating our water resources element. And we're working with a consultant on that. And part of the components of that, we built in adding a BLI modeling component. So the consultant right now is building a model for both the residential and the commercial elements of the BLI. So going forward, it'll be interesting to see what happens and how we move forward, but we potentially will be doing at least part of the process through Model Builder.
okay. And so you've had this in place for about 20 years and a couple of your comp plan processes then.
Yep. Yeah, we actually, our original, we started probably in the early 90s with a land use holding capacity. That's what we called it, using paper maps, the whole thing. But we've definitely, it's been almost 20 years, yep, since we've started running it. So we have numbers we can go back 20 years to compare what has happened and compare to what actually has happened with development and how it compares to the numbers that we've projected.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Do any other members have questions or want additional information on the slides as offered?
Hi, this is Jamie Williams. I'm just curious if we can have a copy of this. I know I came in a little bit late and then I see the start of it. So
Okay.
sending out a
Yes,
copy
we
of their
can-
presentation.
Yes,
Yes, and
Sean
Jamie,
has this presentation and we can send it around.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I'll be posting it to our webpage, and I'll let you guys know when that is placed on our webpage.
Perfect, thanks.
And Sean, I'll add to that. I'll send you, well, you have my information and I'll send you Mike's information. You can add to that. If anybody has any specific questions, they can reach out to obviously Kathleen, but also if you have more technical questions, you can reach out to myself or Mike Roberts.
Oh, terrific. I did have a question for Kathleen, just to tie in this analysis to the estimates and the forecasts. So do you take the available units from the output of this and use that to formulate your out year for your projections for population and households?
I used it as a component of that. Initially, I was kind of trying to do it like scientifically, but it actually gave me too high of numbers. But I definitely used it in the process and also directed me where the development would be. And I also looked at plans, approved subdivisions, any projects in process, things like that. So it heavily influenced the estimates.
Okay.
But it wasn't like a 1-to-1, like I took, the elders or freedom areas 2,726 times whatever. It wasn't like 1-to-1 like that, but it greatly influenced the estimates.
Okay.
It's just that it put it too high.
Okay. And in the
Because the other thing was, what does this reflect? Because we wanted it up to 2050. And, how much of this would be developed by 2050? So that was part of it. It was hard to determine how much of this would be developed by then. So it influenced it, but then I used other, like I said, projects in process, planned subdivisions, UNO data, what happened previously, that kind of stuff. It was kind of multifaceted.
Yeah, oh, and I did notice and you had mentioned in the commercial and employment center zones, is that mostly multifamily that's located in those areas?
I think, like, are you talking about its employment campus up here where you see 45?
Yeah,
The
those
striped blue area. My understanding is that it could be commercial development, employment campus specifically, or potentially a mix of uses, or residential. So it's kind of up in the air right now.
Okay.
But you have any insight on that, Sandy? Additional?
No, that's actually a fairly new component to our zoning for those areas. So I'm not super familiar with that. I know we already have a little bit of that in a commercial development on Liberty Road in Eldersburg. It was a Princess Shopping Center, and on the second floor they built condos. So that's similar to one of the visions, but I'm not familiar with exactly what the plans are for some of those developments.
Okay, thank you.
And just a quick question following up on kind of what Sean was saying, how you get from building permits and dwelling units and your land inventory into a population projection, because that's a challenge for us in Queen Anne's County, where we've done a number of building permits, and in this last census we had very little population growth, and so we're seeing the tie between building permits and population growth move farther and farther apart. It's harder and harder to predict based on building permits how our population's going to grow. And I was just wondering how you may have taken this inventory number of dwelling units and how it equated to the population projections you provided. Whether you're running into those same challenges or you guys have a closer correlation between the number of building permits and population growth.
Well, one thing that I did, I built a spreadsheet, and I had different columns, and for the BLI, that gave me the limit. It gave me what could possibly be built. So if something couldn't be possibly be built, or you only had a low number of possible units, then that locked that down. I couldn't go above that. So first of all, I had this gave me a good feel for what development could occur and what the limits were. So I had the limits, but I used a lot of different types of data, because I had, at that time, I also knew that, for instance, back in, I think in 2021, when I was doing this, I knew that Tawnytown still had some additional development. It still had some homes being built that didn't get the UNO certificate yet. And so it was easier to do the 2020 to 25, 2025 and 2025 to 2030. I think the further you get away from that, the less accurate the projections might be. But most of them, so I put it like a little bubble between 2020 and 2025 in my estimates, and then just a slight bubble from 2025 to 2030. But I looked at a lot of data. I looked at past data, but I also looked at where our projects are, what's in the pipeline. And I looked at this data too. Mm-hmm. And, you see places where there's only one. Well, and I would actually total those up by the TAS zones. So I totaled up the potential BLI by TAS zone, and that gave me a limit. But it also let me know what areas could possibly be developed and what type of development could occur. So So that helped with both the residential and employment component of the estimates. But like I said, it wasn't like scientific one-to-one, because I did try that. I tried different methods and I'm like, whoa, that's too high. And then how much, how much of this BLI could possibly be developed by 2050, and how realistic is that? Because the other thing is we have water and sewer issues. So, might not be able to be totally built out, or certain areas totally built out by 2050 when you have water and sewer resource limits. So, so I just tried to be as realistic as possible.
Yeah, so
I mean, there's a lot to consider. I think it's like it's an art. I think doing estimates is an art. It's part science, part what do you call the crystal ball, and part part of it's your best intuition about what's probably going to happen or may happen, that kind of stuff.
That's for sure.
I think it's
Yep.
because even if you look at the estimates, done for the state, you'll see that they, didn't hit the mark. I don't think anybody, hits the mark. I think it's part of it's a guess. Your best guess.
Absolutely. We do the best we can with what we got.
Right.
Sure.
And that's why we have the rounds, because once we see things happening, then we can adjust them. So like I think like next year, I think the group had talked about maybe starting work on a new round, possibly.
Yes, I think that will be a discussion coming up in the next few meetings, is looking at schedules and trying to figure out when that next update will be. And we can talk about that in more detail in our coming meetings.
But something that I'm noticing now is that there's been since Tawny Town has slowed down, there is some talk of some future development, but at the moment they've slowed down. And so our UNOs for Carroll County have actually been a lot lower this year compared with last year. So, things, come and go. I mean, one year it might be very high, and then another year the UNOs are low. So, and I base my monthly estimates on the use and occupancy data.
Got it.
Which translates best to the household, estimates.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I do a little bit to also try to account for the group quarters, since the UNOs translate mainly to the homes.
Mm-hmm.
So I allow a little bit of adjustment.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, that was a very detailed and a very helpful presentation, especially for me, dealing with a very similar methodology. So any other questions or comments on this agenda item? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is a briefing on Census Bureau's population estimates program and methodology. And we have Eric Jensen, Senior Advisor for Population Estimates, here to present.
Hey, thank you, Sean. My colleague, Lauren Bowers, will pull up the presentation. Great, thanks, Lauren. So I'm going to provide an overview of the U.S. Census Bureau's Population Estimates Program. My name is Eric Jensen. I'm the Senior Advisor for Population Estimates and Coverage Measurements. And with me is Lauren Bowers, who's Chief of the Population Estimates Branch. So an overview of my presentation, I'll talk about the Population Estimates and Projections Program, general concepts that we use when talking about population estimates. I'll talk about the post-census estimates, the different things that we produce, so different products that we have, and the methods and the input data, and then, you know, how we kind of produce those, and then we'll get into some questions and discussion. So to start out, I'll talk about population estimates program. So the population estimates program disseminates official measures of population and housing units between the decennial censuses. So it's mandated by federal law. There's quite a few important use cases. Probably the biggest one that people are aware of is that the population estimates are used to distribute hundreds of billions of dollars each year in federal funding. We're used as population controls for all of the major demographic surveys done by the U.S. Census Bureau, also surveys that are done by other federal agencies and even some private organizations use our population estimates as controls. They're also used as denominators for vital rates and other important rates produced by the CDC and the National Center for Health Statistics. A lot of academics and businesses use our estimates for research. And then, you know, you guys know a lot about this, but program planning, planning and forecasting and other things. So we produce a time series of data that goes back to the last census, and it goes until the current year. We use July 1 of the current year as our midpoint, because that's the midpoint of the year. And another thing I wanted to point out is that we work closely with members of what's called the Federal, State, and Cooperative for Population Estimates, FSCPE. And we work closely with these state partners to get input data, and also we talk with them about our methodology. So the schedule, every year we re-estimate the entire time series starting at the last census date, and then we add new additional data to that time series. So we release our data on a rolling basis. So in December, we released the national and state level total population, components of change, and voting age population. In March, we released the total population and components of change for counties. And usually we also do the metropolitan, micropolitan areas at that time as well. In April, we released the national population by age and sex. In May, we have the city and town population and the nation, state, and county level housing units. And then June is one of our it's probably our biggest release of the year. That's the nation, state, and county level population by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. So I'll go over now some general concepts related to the population estimates. I'll talk specifically about type of population estimates products, estimates versus projection, census versus estimates base. I'll explain what modified race is and why we use that in pop estimates. I'll talk about vintages and what those mean and how we can conceptualize vintages. And then I'll talk about the geographies we use to make our sub-county estimates. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the order of estimates production and how we go about doing all this. So there's several different data products that we produce each year, or not each year, that we produce and that people use. The biggest are our post-census estimates, and so they start at the latest census, and the endpoint is the current year, so July 1 of the current year. Next, we have our intercensus estimates, which take the previous census and connect them to the most recent. So it would go the most recent census, and it connects that to the one before that. So right now we're working on our intercensus estimates, and so that's the 2010 census and the 2020 census. What we do is we sort of connect those two points, and we adjust the time series in between so that it's consistent. This is a really important series of estimates that people use, especially as denominators, because it's consistent between the two censuses. We also produce our evaluation estimates. So each decade, as we come to a new census, we produce evaluation estimates that we can compare to the new census. And that way we can judge how close our estimates were. You know, did we pick up the growth and everything that happened during the decade? This is really a way for us to evaluate the quality of our of our estimates. And it's not really what we'd call like a coverage measure or a way to evaluate quality of the decennial census. We do have the demographic analysis estimates. That's a program I lead here at the Census Bureau. But the demographic analysis estimates are an evaluation of the decennial census. And those estimates are interesting because we're not starting from a base like that comes from the previous census. We're actually starting from historical birth records and accounting for deaths and migration to those cohorts over time. So for the 2020 demographic analysis, we started with birth records back to 1945. We accounted for deaths, we accounted for immigration and immigration into those cohorts until up to 2020, and all cohorts, all subsequent cohorts. So it's a very sort of detailed process, but it gives us what we feel is an independent benchmark that we can use to evaluate coverage in the decennial census. Then finally, we have our population projections. And these, the starting point is the current year, and we go out 50 or more years. And we actually have projections that we're releasing later this fall. So I think people will be very interested in that. So quick estimates versus projections. Estimates are recent or current time periods, whereas estimates are future time periods. For both estimates and projections, we use administrative data. And so we get birth records from the National Center for Health Statistics, deaths from National Center for Health Statistics. Then we use other data for international migration. As far as projections, we use those as kind of to look at the trends in these administrative records that we can then use as a starting point for the projections. In the estimates, we don't look at any kind of like different series. We just give one number, and that's important, especially if you think about funding. No one wants to say, oh, there's different scenarios around our funding estimates. But for projections, we do have some leeway that we can come up with some assumptions about future trends, and we can give different scenarios. Those could be based on fertility patterns. They can also be based on international migration or mortality. The ones that we're releasing later this fall, the variation in the different series is going to come from international migration. And then we produce the population estimates annually for all levels of estimates geography. So that would be the nation, states, and counties, and then our sub-county areas, so cities and towns. Whereas the projections are only produced for the nation, and we don't produce those every year. It's sort of as we have the resources the time and resources to produce those. So now I want to talk quick about the census versus the estimates base. So the census, of course, is the enumerated population and the geographic boundaries that existed on April 1st. And there's normally no corrections or updates. The estimates base, however, is the enumerated population that's retabulated into current geographies. So as geographic boundaries change during the decade, we retabulate the census numbers so that our starting point or base for the population estimates is consistent with those later geographies. And then we can include corrections such as count question resolution or other programs such as like the special census program, which allows localities to do a new census during the decade, and we then incorporate those results into our estimates base. Okay, so the decennial census includes a category for some other race. However, the administrative data that we use to produce the population estimates, like the birth and death records coming from the National Center for Health Statistics, they do not include the some other race category. And so in order for us to use decennial census data, we have to use what we call our modified race process. This is something we do. What we basically do is we take those some other race responses and we allocate those into other OMB categories. And so there's a process that we have for doing that. So currently we're researching this and we're trying to get a file out. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this file. We publish it on our population estimates website, and it's really what allows people to use population estimates data with the decennial census data and to have consistent race groupings. So I mentioned several times the idea of vintages. So we produce a time series, and it's from the last census, last decennial census date to the current year. Every year we revise that time series to include geographic updates, the latest administrative records, the latest methods, and to add another year of data. And each new vintage supersedes all prior vintages. So just to kind of help us sort of visualize this, I have a graph that shows historic vintage comparisons of the resident population. This is for Santa Clarita City, California. Santa Clarita City, California is in Los Angeles County. And after the 2010 census, there were several annexations of parts of territory from the balance of Los Angeles County that went to Santa Clarita. So the blue lines at the bottom, those are the vintage estimates for Santa Clarita City, California, up until vintage 2016. You see there are just really slight differences in the estimates over that time. But then in 2016 or in 2017, there was some annexations that happened. And so now we see the orange line, which are annexations that happened in 2017 and 2018. And then we jump up, we see again in 2019 that there was another annexation. So this just kind of illustrates how the vintages work. So if we were to not go back and re-estimate the time series, then we would end up with this dashed line, which is basically that July 1st value for each of the different estimate years. We would see pretty consistent up until 2016, and then a big jump up caused by that annexation, and then another jump up after that. What this would do is it would make it look like there's a whole bunch of population growth when really it's annexation and it's caused by a boundary change. So this is why we re-estimate the vintage each time. And again, the most recent vintage supersedes the prior ones. And so the best estimate for Santa Clarita City would come from the vintage 2020 estimate, which would reflect the boundary consistently throughout the decade. So we do produce sub-county estimates of the population. We don't do those by characteristics, so we only have a total population, but this is for cities and towns. To do this, we have to have mutually exclusive and exhaustive geographic areas. And so this is our lowest level of estimates geography that we then aggregate to counties. And these different geographic areas kind of vary by state and county because there's variation across the country in the type of units that we have. So for instance, minor civil divisions, some states have MCDs while other states don't. And so that kind of determines how we release some of the estimates, but we have to get them into these primitive geographies first. So next I have a graph that shows, this is just a made up example, but we can talk through how we get to the primitive sub-county geography. So on the top left, we have a state with 3 counties: the blue county, the red, the pink county, and the gray county. And then we have different geographic areas. We have overlapping geographies. So first of all, the sub-county geographic levels can nest completely within a county. If you see the little blue city number 1 and little blue city and big blue city number 2, they're all completely within the blue county. In the pink county, we have townships. So we have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They're in the pink county. And then we have red city, which is within the pink county. Sub-county geographic levels. Just one second. So sub-county geographic levels Am I frozen?
No? No.
There we go. Okay. I thought I was frozen for a second. Perfect. Okay, they can also cross county boundaries. So you see Purple City in the middle, number 3. So it's partly in blue, it's partly in pink, and it's partly in gray. And then they can, sub-county geographic levels can overlap with other sub-county geographic levels. So you see Red City, number 4, that it's in between those 2 townships, 6 and 7. So just, I guess this shows how complex sub-county geographies can be. So for the estimates production, we need to create records for each mutually exclusive part. So for example, Big Blue City and Little Blue City are naturally primitive because they fall within the county. And so we'd have those 2 be primitive geographies, and then the balance of county could be the rest. So Purple City would get broken up into 3 different parts. So part of it is in County D, part of it's in the Pink County, part of it's in the Gray County. The Red City also gets broken up, and so we have part of the city which is in a certain township, part of it's in the other township, and so we divide it out like that. And then finally, we need the balance of county records for like the Blue County and the Gray counties. And so that's that part C down in the lower right and part G. So again, in order for us to make sub-county estimates, we have to get it down to this very primitive, what we call the primitive sub-county geography. So I'm sure this is very clear for everyone and there's no questions. But I guess just it shows the complexity of what we do, and you might be familiar with this already as you see how it plays out in your particular county that you work with. All right, so next our order of estimates production. So we feel the estimates for larger populations are generally more reliable than estimates for smaller populations, and this is the same. So this applies for geographic details, so or by geographic level. So we feel that our estimates for the nation are more reliable than estimates for like counties. And then if you look like bigger, like age groups or bigger race groups, the estimates be more reliable than for smaller race groups or smaller age groups. And so that's why we produce the estimates in the way we do. Also because of because of the way the estimates are released, and our customer requirements also determines how we produce the estimates, like our order in which we produce them. So I have a graph here. If we go the 2 slides that shows this. So we start with the national pop by characteristics, and then from there we go down and we produce the county total population. That gets summed up to the state total population, which then we use to create the state population estimates by characteristics. And then finally, we create the county population by characteristics. We also have our housing unit estimates, and that is a little different, where we start with the nation for our population estimates. For our housing estimates, we start with our sub-county total population, we start with our sub-county housing units. Then we aggregate those up to county, to state, and then to nation. And those sub-county housing units feed into our sub-county total population. And I'll talk more about that in a second, about how we produce our sub-county estimates. Okay, overall, our method, we use a cohort component method for our estimates for the counties, the states, and the nation. So here we're looking at components of change in the input data, so births, deaths, and international migration. We also have our housing units. We use components of change for those as well, but they're different components. So we have new building permits. We look at housing unit loss. And then we have some other variables as well. For our sub-county estimates, we use what's called the distributive housing unit method. So if you're familiar with the housing unit method, you take the persons per household, you multiply that by the number housing units, and that should give you your population. So we have a slight change to that, but it's pretty much the traditional housing unit method. Okay, so for our population estimates, and this is from the county, for the county, state, and nation, our estimate is the population base. We add births, we subtract deaths, and then we add net migration. So our inputs to create these estimates, first of all, for the base, the decennial census is our main input, including the CQR updates and retabulated into the current geographies. Before the 2020 census, we had no additional processing that was done for the population estimates other than the CQR updates and the boundary changes. After 2020, because of limited data that we had and that were available to us, we started using an approach that we call a blended base, where we're taking the 2020 census results, data from the demographic analysis estimates, and also data from the vintage 2020 population estimates. And the vintage 2020 population estimates use the 2010 census as their base. And we put these all together into what's called the blended base. And we do have a team, it's the Base Evaluation Research Team, or BERT, that's looking at ways that we can improve the base that's being used for the population estimates. And so we're looking at ways that we can possibly account for coverage error in the 2020 census. We're also looking at ways that we can address irregular patterns in the age distribution in the base. And all of this is to make the best population estimates that we can. So this graphic shows the blended base and sort of how it all comes together. So at the nation, we get our total resident population from the 2020 census. So the red is 2020 census. The green is the demographic analysis estimates, and then the teal is the vintage 2020 population estimates. So at the national level, our total comes from 2020 census. Our age and sex distribution comes from the 2020 demographic analysis estimates. Again, those are used to measure coverage in the census. And then our characteristics for Hispanic origin and for race are both coming from the vintage 2020 population estimates. And those use the 2010 census as the base. Because demographic analysis is only produced at the national level, we don't have state or county demographic analysis estimates. When we go to states and counties, we don't have that direct demographic analysis estimate that we can use, but we do use the national estimates as a control for the states and the counties. And so we make sure that everything sums to the nation, and at the counties, we make sure everything sums to the states. Again, we're using a lot of the 2020, vintage 2020 estimates. And as the decade goes on, we're incorporating more and more 2020 census data as it becomes available and as we're able to. Okay, so that was about the base. Let's talk about inputs for births and deaths. So we get vital records from the National Center for Health Statistics. Those are usually lagged by about 2 years. So if a birth occurred in 2020, we didn't get those data until 2022. Same with deaths. And I mentioned earlier our partners, the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. We work with them to get some totals, some county and state county totals that we can use to kind of overcome that lag. We can often get an extra year, a year earlier, get some of those data, but they're not available by all the characteristics and everything. That would just be totals. It's not, what we need to produce the full estimates. So we have to use some additional methods. So one issue with the birth records is that they don't list the race or Hispanic origin of the child. They only list the race and Hispanic origin of the parents. And so we have a process for assigning race to the birth records and Hispanic origin. We have to kind of reconcile the distribution of births within a state with the data we get from the federal state cooperative for population estimates. And then we have to project births out to the current vintage year. So that's our overall method. Net international migration. So this is really the hardest component to estimate. We have a lot of uncertainty in our methods. So our total net international migration estimate, the two biggest parts, foreign-born immigration, so the foreign-born population coming into the United States, and then foreign-born immigration, those leaving. We also include an estimate of net Puerto Rico migrants, also net native migrants, and finally military migrants. And our inputs for these different components, they come largely from the American Community Survey. Also, we use the Puerto Rico Community Survey, the PRCS. We use NCHS life tables. We also use population registers and censuses from approximately 80 countries. And then for our military data, we get information from the Defense Manpower Data Center. And then we have various methods that we use. The DCMD data is used for military movement. The NCHS life tables are used as we're producing immigration rates or calculating immigration rates. And then we use ACS data where possible for a lot of this. Then our estimates of net domestic migration. So our main input for these estimates comes from the Internal Revenue Service. We also use Medicare records, and then we assign characteristics to these records. So what we do is we match individual IRS and Medicare records for 2 consecutive years, and then we look for a change in address between those records. So if someone filed taxes in 2021 at one address, and then in 2022 they filed at an address in a different county, we would use that to calculate rates of in movers and out movers between counties. This table shows the 2022 population estimates and components of change for different counties here in the DC metro area. I won't, just for sake of time, go into too much detail, but overall we see that there's the domestic migration is probably the biggest component for most of the counties here in the DC metro area, which you would expect being a large metro, you know, and just the dynamics of labor and everything here in this area. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about our sub-county population estimates. So again, it was this, we have the housing units, but then sub-county pop, because it is a different method. It's not the cohort component method. So for housing units, we use a component of change method. So we have the housing unit base, and then we add new construction, we subtract housing unit loss, and then we account for conversions. So that seems pretty straightforward, and we do this for the nation, states, and counties, and sub-counties. We use the annual primitive level housing unit estimates produced using the component change method. And then the whole higher levels are used by aggregating the primitive areas. And the 2020 census housing unit counts are invariant. So what that means is the 2020 census, in order to have disclosure avoidance, in order to prevent to protect confidentiality, we have new disclosure avoidance program here at the Census Bureau, and that program uses a method called differential privacy to add noise to the data in order to again protect privacy. And the housing units don't have that noise added. That's great for us in the pop estimates area because it makes our estimates of housing units more accurate. And then that's also good because they feed into our sub-county estimates. Okay, next slide. So for the components of change by source, we get building permits. We also look at completion rates, or we multiply that by completion rates. We have non-permitted housing builds. We have mobile home shipments. We have housing unit loss, and then we have disaster loss. For disaster loss, we've recently started working with with FEMA in order to get some data from them to use in our estimates, and that's really helped improve the estimates. We also get data from the FSCPE. So they give us updates to any of the components that I listed on the left, except for completion rates. We get certificates of occupancy from them, and we replace those. We replace them with building permits and completion rates once we have the certificates of occupancy. And then conversions, we get a lot of information from the FSCPE on conversions. So this is residential to non-residential, vice versa. Okay, to develop our sub-county population estimates, we have a distributive housing unit method. So first we get our initial household population estimate, and we do that by taking the housing unit estimate and then multiplying it by the household population base divided by the housing unit base. This is not exactly persons per household, but it's very similar to that. Once we have that initial household population, we plug that into the next equation to get resident population. So we take that initial household population and we multiply it by a county household rate factor. This is just to ensure that our total is going to match what's in our county population estimates, and so they're consistent. And then we add group quarters population. So that gives us the resident population estimate for sub-county areas. Okay, so we have that. I mentioned the implied persons per household unit from the estimates base. We have a county rate factor. So it's the county total household population. That's divided by the sum of the county primitive household population. And again, that ensures that all the primitive units add up to the county total that we have in our county estimates. And then to get household population, we add GQ to the household pop. Sorry, to get resident population, we add household pop to GQ. And then our sub-county areas, so these are cities and towns, we aggregate all the primitive areas up to get those. And we do include challenges and special censuses. By challenges, I mean we have a program where a local government can challenge our population estimates. They can provide new data and to show that our estimates are not accurate. And we'll evaluate those data. And if it looks like there is an issue with our estimates, we'll accept the challenge and we'll put in that new value, and we'll use it from, whatever time period is challenged, we'll use it from that point forward to develop the population estimates. All right, and with that, I list our contact information and just want to open it up to any questions or comments that people have about the population estimates program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a lot of information there. Any questions for Eric?
Oh, I did have a question. This is Kathleen Comer. When you introduce noise into the data, basically how's that done? Because I was looking at some group quarters data by the census block, and I knew where certain facilities were located and things like that. And there was some areas where the data in the census block didn't seem to match up with where the facility was located. Like maybe it was a census block over or something. So how's noise introduced, and how much noise is introduced? How much does it affect the estimate?
So I'm not an expert on that process, and maybe Lauren can help me here. But the Census Bureau adopted what's called a modernized disclosure avoidance program for the 2020 census. They're using a statistical method called differential privacy. And there's been a lot of work the last several years to sort of show how it would impact the data, using especially the 2010 census. There are a lot of test files that were produced, demonstration products, they're officially called, that showed the impact. So the way it works, there's a specific statistical method that is supposed to randomly inject noise. When I say randomly, it's not supposed to produce any kind of systematic bias. So the theory is that large counties would get the same amount of noise as small counties, and large race groups would get the same amount of noise as small race groups. And so it's not, in theory, going to bias the data anyway. How it ends up working in practice, it does impact the data as far as, like you said, you'll look in one block group for certain characteristics that you might know, and they're not there, and that's because it does shift things around. It's
So
similar
could,
to our
the data could
estimate.
be moved to another census block, theoretically.
Yeah, so it's not swapping, which is what we've done in the past, where we'd actually move, people around, so to speak. It's injecting noise. If it seems like a GQ facility is completely missing, that could be another issue, and not necessarily the differential privacy process. We do have, I mentioned count question resolution, which is a process after the census where if we miss something, we can add that back in. And there's a similar process this decade for GQs, because the 2020 census, it was really difficult for us to enumerate GQs, and there was a lot of problems, especially given the circumstances of the pandemic. Lauren, do you have anything to add to that about why Kathleen might be seeing missing data from some? Are you looking at blocks or track group or census tracts?
It was at the block level. It was
Okay.
Smaller.
Out of curiosity, are those occupied GQs, or they have population living in them?
Can you say that again?
Those are occupied group quarter facilities, meaning.
I believe so. I mean, I have to go back and check and look more closely, but it was just that, a lot it did match up, but then there was just some I was like, this is kind of odd.
Yeah, no, that
it seemed to be in the wrong block. That's all.
Yeah, so.
But it was hard to tell because with group quarters, I mean, I know facilities, but I don't know. Okay, could there be, what we don't have a lot of information on is where these group homes are out in the community.
So with the differential privacy, the number of occupied GQ facilities, GQ, so group quarter facilities, but not the population counts, are invariant at the census block by correctional facilities, juvenile facilities, nursing facilities, other institutional facilities, college and university, military quarters, and other non-institutional facilities. So it basically covers the whole gambit. So they should not have the wrong geographic code if they are an occupied group quarter facility with population. So I'm gonna put the brief with the differential privacy information in the chat. If you do feel like there is an issue with how these are geocoded, your FSCPE rep can submit a correction for the population estimate through something we call our group quarter request. So if you would like to get in contact with them, they could potentially modify that where these are geocoded for the estimates themselves in the future, and that would impact your sub-county estimate.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. All right, I'll go ahead and put that link in the
chat. Eric?
Yeah.
So just to give a little bit of background, This group here generates the estimates and forecasts for the jurisdictions in the Baltimore region. One way that we use the population estimates data is to compare it to what our short-term forecasts look like. So for example, the 2022 population estimate will take our 2020 to 2025 forecast and interpolate what 2022 might be, compare them to the Census Bureau's estimate, and that helps this group decide whether or not they want to update to their current forecast. I guess my question is, when I look at the vintage 2020, noise in the background. Check your mic. So I think when you look at the vintage 2020 estimates and you compare them to the decennial 2020, which I think is a process you go through with your evaluation estimates, we see some pretty sizable differences. Like just as an example, Baltimore County was different. Baltimore County's decennial figure was about 30,000 persons higher than the vintage 2020 estimate, and that's about 3.5%. Outside our jurisdiction, Prince George's County, theirs was different by 58,000 or 6.3%. And then at the state level, places like New York, theirs was different by 4.5%, but like 860,000 people. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, are those kind of disparities, normal at the end of the decade compared to the then current decennial census, or are some of the operational challenges faced by the Census Bureau during the 2020 decennial census, does that have something to do with it, or are these differences that I've observed just kind of how it is?
That's a great question. So you're right, we do our estimates evaluation at the end of each decade, where we compare to see how well our estimates look compared to the census. Now, when we do that comparison, it's important to realize that there's 3 different reasons why they could be different. The previous census, so the 2010 census, which was our starting point for the vintage 2020 estimates, there could be error there. There could be coverage error, there could be measurement error, there could be error in that census. So that's one source. Another source is, as we move through the decade and we're doing the estimates, there could be error in how we're doing that. So maybe it's our domestic migration estimates. Maybe we weren't moving enough people into Baltimore, and so our estimates were low at the end of the decade. And then there's error in the new census. So, and we know 2020 census had a lot of challenges. New York, we saw overcounts overall for the state of New York. Or sorry, not overcounts. We saw that the estimates were lower than the census. But in other parts of the country, we saw that the estimates were higher than the census. And so how do we make sense of all that? We look specifically at the trends in like those places where we were different from the population estimates. For example, in counties along the border region in Texas, our population estimates were much higher than the census. So what does that mean? Does it mean how we are estimating international migration was too high for those counties? It could be. Could also be that Hispanic populations in those counties didn't respond to the census, and there were undercounts for those groups. So we don't know exactly, but we look at these patterns. Another thing that we can look at, we look at this for the total population, like you mentioned, we also look at characteristics. So we can see like what the characteristics are in the estimates and in the census to get a more granular idea of why there might be differences. And another thing we've done is we've compared our state, those differences between the state estimates and the census with the results of the post-enumeration survey. And so that comparison is not necessarily a coverage measure. The post-enumeration survey is a coverage measure, and they have estimates of undercounts and overcounts for states. And what we've seen is that for the most part, our states that the post-enumeration survey showed was not statistically that were statistically significant. So they had either a significant overcount or undercount. That it really corresponds closely with our differences between the vintage 2020 estimates and the census estimates. As far as the magnitude of difference between that estimates evaluation in 2010 and 2020, in general, looking at like mean absolute error and the MAPE and other metrics, the results are pretty similar at the state and the counties between what we saw in 2010 when we did our estimates evaluation and what we saw in 2020. That's just total population though. Once you get into characteristics, we do see a lot of kind of big differences. And I mentioned earlier, like in some places we see that the Hispanic population was much higher in the estimates than it was in the census. So were we overestimating Hispanics in some way? We could have been. Did the 2010 census have, a higher number of Hispanics than was actually there? That could be it. Or it could be something about 2020 where Hispanics might not have participated as much. So again, there's these three sources of error, and we try to kind of figure out which is most likely. Historically, this estimates evaluation has been a way for us to kind of refine our methodology, and because we use the census as our benchmark and try to improve things moving forward. 2020, just given all that happened, we're using it in that way, but we're also using our estimates to evaluate the quality of the census and sort of flipping that approach around and doing an evaluation. We've actually released a couple of blogs and other things talking about this, and I can put that in the chat for people.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that explanation. Did you have any other updates on the looking at the blended base approach, and if that's going to be if that's going to continue with vintage 2023, or is there a thought going forward that some of the lessons learned with this blended base approach, maybe there were some positives in that approach and maybe that'll continue?
Yeah, for vintage 2023, we are definitely still using the blended base. Part of that is we don't yet have the modified race file that we need to use race data from the 2020 census. I actually lead a team here in the POP Estimates program that's working closely with the folks that are doing the disclosure avoidance, because we have to have noise added to those data before we can use them in our POP Estimates program. So we're still working to get the modified race file. After that's available, will we just go right to using only the 2020 census? We don't think so. There's some improvements that we have made by using the blended base. For example, I mentioned earlier we use the demographic analysis estimates as a control at the national level for age and sex. And one of the things that does is when we use the DA estimates, we actually improve the data for young children. Young children age 0 to 4 are the age group with the largest undercount in the census. That was in 2020, that was in 2010. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s census, the young children have a really large undercount compared to other age groups. So when we use that demographic analysis, when we use that national demographic analysis estimates control, it actually it corrects for that undercount for young children. So that's something we don't want to move away from. So it's a good question how long we're going to be using the blended base. We know we'll be using it for vintage 2023. I suspect we'll be using it later as well, as we're making improvements to the census base. Again, our whole approach is to have the best estimates that we can of the population, and so anything we can do to to improve that. So we're looking at ways to improve irregular patterns in the age distribution. I'll put another link to a blog that we did in May talking about age heaping
Okay.
in the 2020 census, and I think your group will find that interesting if they haven't seen it already.
Okay. Great, thank you.
So I had a quick question. I might have missed this in the presentation. When you were referring to primitive areas, was that sub-county, cities and towns, or was that places absorbed?
Primitive areas are even smaller than they're even smaller than cities and towns. It can be a city or town could be its own primitive area. But if it's like part of another jurisdiction, we can even divide it more and then take the parts and add back up to the city and town. I hope that answers your question. But if we look at this thing here, if A and B in the lower right are cities, they would be its own primitive geography. But if you look at the big purple circle, that can be broken up into several different primitive geographies that then get added together later to make the sub-county estimates.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so it all depends on sort of the if it's overlapping or not with other geographies.
Okay, so the overlap is what? What key that term?
Right, the overlap is what determines if it gets subdivided even more. But then later we do combine them to get back to the cities and towns, which is what we release the sub-county estimates at.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what you were saying there.
Okay, was there any other questions from the group for Eric?
Eric and Lauren, thank you very much. That was a very helpful and informative presentation.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is UPWP task update, and Sean will go through that with us.
Yes, and I will make this brief. Okay, as you all know, this group, the CFG, we began the journey of getting this consultant task in the UPWP about a year ago, in August of last year. The idea was that CFG membership was interested in receiving, consultant or expert guidance regarding the considerable change brought on by the pandemic and the associated increase in work from home work arrangements. At the time of the round 10 data development, membership and the rest of the world really had limited information available regarding the full scale of the pandemic impacts, timing and duration of a recovery, and longer term implications. The pandemic caused or accelerated major changes to how and where people work, with substantial effects upon workers, employment centers, and travel patterns. And the purpose of the task, as outlined by this group, is to identify and quantify these changes and to project and explain their potential longer term implications, thereby informing land use assumptions for future forecast rounds and travel demand modeling efforts. So the RFP was released on July 6th. The consultant questions regarding the RFP content were due to BMC by August 8th. BMC staff received a total of 8 questions and posted the questions and responses to our RFP webpage on Friday, August 11th. Proposals are due by August 24th at 2 p.m. That's tomorrow. And you may recall that at the June meeting of the group and in a few subsequent emails, I requested volunteers from CFG membership to assist in the review of these proposals and in the consultant selection process. The review team consists of 2 members of the CFG from Howard and Queen Anne's counties, as well as 2 members of BMC staff. And next steps include the proposal review, which is expected to begin next week. Consultant selection, which is anticipated shortly after the review process is complete, and project kickoff, which will occur as soon as possible after consultant selection. And we're aware of the interest in getting the results of this work in time to inform the next round update or the next round. And we'll make efforts to ensure that the consultant begins work as soon as possible. We expect to receive task deliverables and updates from the consultants as their work progresses. So the thought is that this group would be able to have at least preliminary results to help inform the next forecast update, even if the final report product isn't complete by the time that you would need that information to assist you with a forecast update if there were to be one next year. Also, there will be a standing agenda item for the forthcoming CFG meetings for BMC staff to provide a status update of work progress on this UPWP task. And that is all I have for that. Does anyone have any questions about where we are with this UPWP task and what's next? Okay. Let's see. All right.
Okay, if there's no questions on that, any new business on the agenda?
I do have one thing, Stephen. I was looking for a volunteer for holding capacity analysis presentation for the October meeting of this group. We've had Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Harford County, and Carroll County so far. So that leaves Anne Arundel, Howard, and Queen Anne's County. Is there a volunteer from that group that would be interested in presenting on holding capacity analysis at the October meeting? I don't hear anyone jumping at the opportunity. So
I can check with Mara to see if that's something she's ready to do. She had been working on our, kind of updating our holding capacity model.
okay,
Let me check with her and see where
Okay.
she is with that, and if she's ready to give a presentation.
okay,
And I can get back to you.
okay, great, thanks. Let me know what you find out.
Okay.
And we'll
We can
see.
do that.
Okay. Steve, that was all that that was all that I have.
Okay, and keep me in the loop if they're not able to do it. I'll see if I can be ready for the October meeting.
Okay, great, I appreciate it. We'll get it working.
Okay, any other comments or any other business left? If not, we can go ahead and adjourn the meeting.
Great, thank
The
you,
next-
everybody.
Yep, the next meeting will
Bye-bye.
be October 25th, 2023, and we'll see everybody then. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.